Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the People and Dance First podcast. I think we're on season 2, episode 3, which I'm really excited about because we had a massive break and then we're back with a vengeance. And today I'm really lucky to be joined by Nick Hickmott. Hi, Nick.
I
Hello. And so Nick is somebody who I've met at the premiere of the People and Dance First film. And then I reconnected because I became really interested in the work that he does. He's early intervention lead at We Are With You, which is a charity that operates, I think, around the country, but you're in Kent, right? So,
That's right.
um, and basically, what Nick does is working with young people to promote harm reduction, which to me is I think I can't really think of anything nobler than that. It's such an amazing thing. And so when we had a conversation on Twitter, and when I found out that you were, you've been doing harm reduction work with young people for a while, I was like, whoa, I didn't even know such thing existed. So I immediately was like, come and talk to us about it. So yeah, thanks, Nick, and tell me more about you. Tell me about how you came to work in this field.
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me. It's lovely to be here and lovely to connect properly with you. Like you say, we met briefly a while back, but I think we were just saying before we start recording, weren't we, that we're kind of headed in the right direction as far as we're concerned. So it's great to be here. How did I come to work in this field? So I guess like from the start, I grew up in a small village in Kent, probably quite a middle class upbringing. Lots of young people in the same kind of age group, and I feel like we were displaced really from this kind of background. There was quite a big subculture. There was lots of drugs about, no drug education. Definitely grew up with a just say no kind of narrative going on. Probably from Grange Hill and Zamo and that kind of stuff, which I vividly remember my mum not letting me watch. I was 7 or 8 years old in 1986, but Grange Hill was kind of prime time, and I remember the TV being turned off. And reflecting on that now, maybe that's how I ended up doing what I was doing now. Is that there was kind of behind the veil, behind the curtain, there was stuff going on around substances. But I escaped the village and everything that went with it. And moved up to London and kind of started a degree which didn't go so well. But when I came back, I started working in a residential children's home. So it was a psychodynamic setting, working with young people who'd suffered sexual abuse and physical abuse. And I worked there for 10 years. Kind of came in at the bottom and worked my way up into management. And there I kept seeing kind of adverse childhood experiences, just extreme trauma in these young people's lives. And I was working in the group setting, so working and living with these young people, doing kind of 3-4 day shifts, sleeping in, taking them on holidays, trying to provide positive experiences and doing life story work with them, and also working with wider kind of systemic partners such as social workers and foster carers and things like that. And 10 years in that setting with really quite extreme behaviors a lot of the time. And at the end of it, I was kind of ready for a change. And so this was 2010. And I moved into what was the drug treatment field, and I managed to do that by, there was a national lottery funded project called the Sunlight Project, and that was working with the children of substance misusing parents in Kent. And so I began doing group work with children around addiction, around staying safe, around kind of positive affirmation work. We'd take in food, we'd do like really nice kind of therapeutic settings, and just work with them in school, but about what was going on for them at home in a really kind of holistic way, and join up with partners. And it was really rewarding work. But across the service, I had my eye on the early intervention team, who have always been funded in Kent, and they were doing work with young people in schools who were using substance at risk of exclusion or in pupil referral units or alternative curriculum, normally as a result of using substances in some way. And the work with the younger, these smaller children, some of them were 5-6 years old, real littlies, kind of really interesting. But it had a shelf life for me, and I was really interested in the nitty gritty of substances, and it tied into my kind of my love for dance floors, Julia, really, and growing up going to festivals and gigs. That's kind of how I spent my adolescence and everything that went with that. And so I moved into, managed to get a vacancy, which is quite rare in a really great team like that, and moved into the early intervention team, working with young people in schools. Worked with them for a while, then went and managed a drug treatment service in London for a couple of years, but soon realised that management style was not for me. I wanted to be back working with young people. So came back to Kent and managed to get into a position where I was running the early intervention team and got to pick my own team. And that's where we are now, really, working with young people who are using drugs, working with young people who are at risk of potentially using drugs in the future, and anything in between, really, which obviously I'm happy to explain.
Wow, what a journey. I love that.
Yeah,
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think, like, in your initial role, even though you were doing psychodynamic support, I guess you would have seen a lot of dual diagnosis as well in that context. You know, and just that kind of link between traumatic experience and then kind of chaotic substance use. So I'm wondering whether that was also part of your motivation to kind of join up the two things a bit more, you know, in your kind of final journey to come to supporting young people now.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's really interesting, and I consider myself to be quite a reflective person and practitioner. But some of this stuff is only just really dawning on me now, you know, and I think there was some synchronicity in moving between roles and right place, right time, being signposted by good friends who were kind of like, you know, this is a bit of you, kind of that stuff. But I think more and more what's come to the fore over the last 20 years since I've been working with young people is, you know, that it's not really about the drugs, you know, that underlying all of this is trauma, is, you know, mental health issues, is dual diagnosis, poverty, you know, all these social factors that surround it. And that it's only really now that I feel like we're hitting the tip of the iceberg in kind of these joined up conversations, and the opportunity to air the conversations via kind of podcasts such as yours, where we can share some of this knowledge and start thinking a little bit more. And yeah, so I think continually reflecting on just the journeys that young people face, and the journeys that they face outside of, you know, kind of very privileged lifestyles like my own, to be honest with you, that it's so easy not to think about, but it's there and it's a real reality.
Yeah, because I mean, you know, we know that the majority of young people who use drugs, you know, as a kind of in seeking experiences and in seeking kind of, you know, just joy and so on. Most of them just don't develop particular issues with them. Most of them kind of use them for a while, then kind of grow out of them or use less and less as they kind of progress towards adulthood and inevitable decay. But yeah, it's just, you know, and I think it's like most people are sort of self-regulating, let's say, when using different substances. And it's only when people need the substances to cope with trauma and pain and other stuff that those substances become, you know, really problematic for them. And as you say, you know, it's important to remember that it's not really about the drugs in the majority of cases. Yeah. And I think obviously that's part of what the People in Dance First Project is all about, is to talk about people whose relationship with substances is, you know, is joyful and relatively unproblematic. Although, of course, it's more nuanced than that. And I don't want to just say it's either one thing or the other, but I think it's important to kind of make some kind of distinction. But anyway, as you know, I received a very just say no education, sort of steeped in prohibitionist ideology. And so I then encountered the typical problem of this gap between drugs are bad, don't take them, and then having a great experience or a good experience whilst trying drugs for the first time, and therefore kind of not really trusting any authority or any education that I had received. And I think this experience is common also for people that I've spoken to through the project. And I think it creates a conundrum, because people then they may also kind of by nature of their good experience, they may also kind of do stupid things and do reckless things, and then not understand what they're doing to themselves and to their bodies, and any of the risks involved, and so on. So yeah, and then, you know, it's only later in life, when they get a bit more mature and a bit more experienced, that they're able to maybe make a bit more responsible, or kind of, let's say, self-preserving or self-caring choices about drugs. So yeah, so with all that, so how does the work that you do maybe address that, or you know, how does the work that you do kind of maybe tackle that in some ways?
Yeah, it's a big, really great question. To be honest, it's so I think kind of throughout my upbringing, and I guess how we address it is, you know, is not testimonial. You know, it's not going in as an ex addict, you know, to use a word which hopefully will be banished one day, but it's not going in telling my own story. But part of the way that we start to address that is to kind of reflect on where drug education has come from. So when I speak to young people, I guess as soon as I'm moving into any setting, like if I go into a school and I'm introduced to a group of young people, it will normally be from an incident. So it will normally be that they have been caught with something's happened, someone's overheard something, they've been, you know, something is normally a catalyst. So even though it's early intervention, you know, and I'd still consider it that, it is normally reactionary, because we still are in a massive hangover of the judgment of having a drug worker associated with your school, which we could also say is there for our police colleagues, that, you know, schools actually don't like having police cars in the car park either. So there's this whole British kind of perception of support, which is lost in the stigma and judgment of drugs, for sure. And it's not lost on young people. So when I walk into a classroom, I'm just met with this kind of, ah, oh, fucking hell, you know, like, we've seen this before. Like, we don't want a drugs talk, you know, like, we know it, we know all of this. So okay, but I do think this is going to be different. And I guess the first thing that we have to do is acknowledge that young people are not afforded safe spaces to talk about drugs in society. They are not there at all, particularly not if the young person is 14, 15, 16. So in that mainstream educational environment, any kind of mention of the word drugs will lead to a mushroom explosion of people being involved, often problematically in their life, often as a knee-jerk reaction, which is not needed. So the first thing that we have to do to be able to tackle this is to say this is going to be different. And as a drug worker, I can sit in a grey area as regards your confidentiality and your disclosures within the room, as long as we can operate with a harm reduction ethos, and as long as I'm not worried that you're going to go and do something drastically dangerous, you know, and we can give examples to young people of that, as long as they're not disclosing dealing drugs, for example, where we can't keep them safe in what is a violent kind of subculture that surrounds it. As long as they're not saying things like, you know, I'm going to drop 4 acid on the top of some council blocks this evening, and we don't have a chance to do that work with them. But talking about drugs, we can keep them safe. And obviously, they don't trust that initially, because I'm just a guy, or one of my team is going in and we're presenting something completely new, completely against the narrative that they've been spoken to as regards drugs for their whole lives, which is, this is a safe space, this is a confidential space. If you talk about a drug in here, I'm not going to walk out and tell the pastoral lead or tell the teacher. So yeah, you know, David was talking about using cannabis and so was talking about this or whatever, because that's not going to do you any favor, and they are duty bound to then pass that information on. which we know what that looks like. That looks like going to a senior leadership team, possible referral into early help or social services, possible police contact, mum knows, mum tells nan, nan tells auntie, black sheep, judgment, all this kind of stuff. So they don't believe that initially. So we need to be making sure that we're saying to them, we're going to be here every week. We're going to be here at the same time. We're going to have this protected space in this classroom or in this provision which is suitable, which hasn't got your peers walking past it all the time. It's going to be protected. It's not a punishment, it's a privilege. You're in here to, with an expert, to be able to learn about stuff that's going on around you. And we're normally met with kind of this kind of statement really of like, well, we don't do drugs. And then we can get into straight away, well, we all do drugs. You know, we all do drugs. Like, you know, you've had drugs today. No, we haven't. Well, I'm sure you have. You know, did you have a cup of tea with your breakfast? Did you have a coffee? Have you eaten chocolate today? Have you had any medication? Are you prescribed anything? Like, so straight away they start realizing this is a little bit different. And then what we can do to kind of break down barriers in these first sessions is look back. And I said, like, we don't use testimony, but giving our experience of drug education is a good one. So we can play them the video clips of Mr. T smashing glasses in his hand while he's ripped on steroids, shaking kids, telling them not to use drugs. We can show them the guy who puts the eggs in the pan and says their brains are frying, you know, this is your brain on drugs. We play them these video clips. And I often reference the police officers who I remember doing drug assemblies back when I was a young person, who would show us pictures of car crashes and dead people, essentially, and say, you know, you end up dead or you end up in prison. And a bit like you said, really, with your experience of just saying, no, Julia, you know, I'd look around and I'd look at my peers and I'd think back to kind of, you know, what was going on in the village where I lived every single night. And I just think, I've never seen anyone have, you know, so much as a bad experience at that point in my life when I was in, you know, 15, 16. I've never even seen someone have a challenging psychedelic experience or really been ill, other than off alcohol, which was obviously minimized and not spoken of in these assemblies. It was people with needles hanging out of their arms and a real heavy stigma kind of bashing that went on through them. So I'd kind of sit there, and just as you alluded to there, Julia, I'd feel this disconnect, and I'd feel this kind of issue with trust, really. And I think what I speak to young people about in our first interactions is that is now turned up to 11, because if we look culturally for them, they have got Netflix, streaming services, they've got music, they've got film, and drugs are referenced everywhere. And so they have this whole reference point, as well as obviously the internet, which was on dial-up when I was 16, you know, so you couldn't get this information, but they can become relative experts overnight, although there are lots of problematic kind of facets to that. And these young people have never had a truthful, level, and probably most importantly, respectful conversation around substances, where they're being spoken to as people who have access to substances, as people who are old enough to take substances and trusted to go out on their own and make autonomous decisions. And there's just no guidance whatsoever. So having someone introduced to give drug education to them is, obviously they've had it all before. They've had drop down days where they've had kind of 30 minutes with someone telling them it's bad, but there's been no real acknowledgement and no real expertise around that delivery. It would normally be done either as a testimonial from an ex-addict, or it would be given by a geography teacher, you know. And if I tried to teach geography, Julia, I'd be screwed, same as if they tried to really talk about drugs. So I guess, you know, it's perpetuated by this lack of education as well for professionals. So I was training some police officers recently on young people and substance use, and when they move into the police force, they get half a day's training on drugs. So at best, that's 3 hours with a break.
That's nothing. Come on.
I mean, how many I'm still going, you know, like it's every day, isn't it? Our research is every day, our learning is every day. And for them to have that, and then, you know, I mentioned to you before, I'm in the middle of, well, 2/3 for a social work degree, and the input is pretty much the same around substances. You know, it's a few lectures, and our teachers, you know, do they get any drug education at all? No. So the kind of the messages that are perpetuated by the media, which were absorbed, the Substance Misuse Act, you know, of 1971, which is again the main driver for our policing. Obviously, lots of variations going on with that, particularly at the moment, but inconsistent variations depending on where you are. So a bit of a postcode lottery. Then the young people they've just given up, really. You know, they've just given up trying to get a consistent, balanced, respectful conversation around substances, and that's what we do really well.
Yeah, that's so nice, because I think you sort of highlighted so many acute issues, and I think a lot of it comes from the type of kind of prohibitionist framework that we have, but also some of it comes from the inability of educators, especially in the early years and, you know, at secondary school, to be able to recognize that, you know, young people are agents. You know, they have agency, and they should be not treated with in a kind of top-down dictatorial way. Like if you try to do education in a kind of didactic top-down way all the time, you don't get anywhere, because you know, you might, you know, they may remember some notions, and they may, you know, they may get, you know, retain some information that is useful to them, maybe, but then actually they're not enjoying the process. They're not feeling like they're involved. They're not feeling like they have a stake. And so I think in large part is like that lack of conversation with like authority figures that are like their conversation, like a two-way thing where you have an exchange, where you feel like you're being understood or listened to. And they don't have that with a lot of authority figures. They don't necessarily have a lot of that with teachers, or, you know, the police officers that come in and talk about you'll end up in prison or whatever. Like there's just no recognition that they have experiences that need to be, you know, shared and acknowledged and stuff.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And I think as well, if we look at the adult treatment model, you know, we've moved so far to people being experts in their own experience and service user voice. But as a collective, we're terrified of asking young people about pleasure and drugs, because that's safeguarding, right? So it's absolutely, you know, and I take my hat off to my colleagues who are working with adult services, who are getting that feedback, and we're really working with service user engagement and service user voice. But we're only just really being able to start that, because the elephant in the room is you're condoning drug use. And it's, well, no, we're facilitating a voice for young people. We're facilitating their experiences. We're showing them the respect rather than shutting that conversation down. And that's what happens, is that conversation does get shut down in the most primary of protective factors for them, which is the education system. Like, literally, do not talk about drugs. If you talk about drugs, you are putting a red flag which could stay with you for your whole educational career, for want of a better word, you know?
Yeah. You're right. I mean, you mentioned the word pleasure there, and I was like, yeah, of course, because like we can't acknowledge that like young people are pleasure seekers like everybody else, and like they're obviously venturing into their like taking their first independent steps and making their own decisions outside of parental control. And why shouldn't those decisions be at least informed or talked about, or, you know, to enable you know, young people to talk about what is going on. And it just sounds like a no-brainer, but no, we're like, oh no, because they're not 18 yet, they're not adults, so they can't, you know, it's as if like there's this arbitrary line of like, you know, over 18, under 18, and it's like it doesn't really reflect you know, what young people do and their needs, because we know that most people start experimenting with drugs when they're like, I don't know, 13, 14, and then they just keep going through their adolescence. So there's no point pretending like that it doesn't happen before.
No, but that's very much the common thread, isn't it? Is fingers in ears. Let's pretend it's not happening, you know, and we can see that right through kind of discourse and right through policy to an extent, you know, and certainly, you know, drugs are political, and for young people that means that we're not going there. We're absolutely not going there, and we still definitely experience that in a lot of education settings. I think the majority are now open to pursuing drug education in more of a sexual health and sex education vein, where they are willing to accept, or someone within a staffing team is willing to accept. But schools' drug policy is often very different. So drug education is one thing, but drug policy around exclusion, around kind of more substantial work, which is the work that we do, longitudinal relationship-based group work with small groups of young people, which is not cost effective in terms of Ofsted and results, but is cost effective in terms of behaviour change and young people having somewhere to put some of the motivations for their substance misuse, which are spilling out into class in various behaviours and things like that. So that's essentially where we move to in terms of our group work, is building relationships and kind of saying to young people, you know, I understand that you're not going to trust me. Like, we've just met. I'm this guy. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a police officer. I'm not a social worker. I'm a drug worker. And I'm not here because I think you've got a drug problem. I think I'm here because I think you've got a right to an informed choice, and that actually we all need drug education. And all I'd ask of you as young people is, like, bear with, because I'm going to be here every week. And if you do get a knock on the door from the police, you know, because I often get called a gaffer as well, or a copper, like initially. So, you know, if you do get a knock on the door, if you do get kicked out of school, if you do, if your head of year does start bugging you about this, then by all means come back to me. But that's not going to happen, because I've got an agreement with your school that what goes on in here stays in here. And as that trust builds, which can take much longer in certain settings like pupil referral units or alternative curriculums, obviously, because attachment disorders obviously come into this, and just trusting an adult.
They've already been excluded. They've already been treated punitively once they get there. So of course, like, they get mixed messages, because part of the problem with like operating with a harm reduction ethos and framework within a prohibitive and punitive environment is that harm reduction becomes like an afterthought rather than the philosophy informing the whole approach. So, you know, as you were saying, school policy is zero tolerance, you know, prohibitionist, exclusionary, and then, you know, the work that you do going on underneath, you're going to rebuild that trust, and it's just painstaking, you know, slow, because of course they've been treated like terribly by everybody else.
Absolutely terribly, and often put into, you know, substandard education settings. And again, in terms of mixed messaging, sometimes, not always, and less so perhaps now than, certainly less so than 5 years ago, but now settings where they're allowed to come to school every day stoned, and occasionally sent home from school because they're stoned, and occasionally allowed to stay in school all day because they're stoned. So someone coming in saying that we really just want to support you and give you spaces to talk about this and kind of guide you around it, you know, well, what's the point? Like, really? So you're also kind of building up that motivation for them to kind of contemplate the idea, like that someone could be useful around this, and that there might be an end point to them kind of using in this way, certainly before school, or certainly in a problematic way. Now, that obviously that's a loaded word as well, because what's problematic for them might not be what's problematic from someone else's perception. But I guess to go back to, it's very tangential, isn't it, talking about young people and drugs in this way? And I'm very tangential in my in my conversations, which is maybe not a bad thing for something like this. But I guess the kind of the key to what we do in those groups is to start with I always say we start with a blank whiteboard and a pen in terms of those groups, because the differences in motivations for use and the differences in how these groups of young people or individuals will be using drugs is never the same. So we can't go in with any kind of predetermined, like, okay, so in week 1 we'll do an introduction, in week 2 we'll talk about cannabis, in week 3 we'll talk about alcohol, in week 4 we'll talk about MDMA. The job's not to introduce drugs to young people, it's to work with what they're experimenting with, and to really, as you were saying earlier, acknowledge the fact that they are experts in their experience, that they have autonomy and that they are individuals. So really handing it over to them, and we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about, and we'll get that up, and we'll kind of write that out, and we'll map how that feels, and we'll talk about positives and negatives straight away, straight out the bat, so they have an understanding of pleasure versus potential harms, or pleasure, more pleasure versus unwanted or undesirable effects might be a better way of saying it. And then start to kind of work around that relationship building. And that's not via teaching them so much about drugs, but facilitating that conversation. So in a kind of supervisory way, kind of perching on the edge of the desk with them while they kind of have it out and say, like, no, that's a load of old nonsense, like, you don't know what you're on about, and taking the positive bits and just constantly, like, positive affirming, so we build a picture of everything that's okay, and that we gently dismiss the bits which are myths or the bits which are inaccurate, or we raise that and empower someone else to kind of challenge that and attack the point, not the person. So it really is more of a kind of, we sit in a facilitating kind of position where we are almost supervising the group who are experts in their own substance use. And then when curveballs come in about, well, what about DMT? Okay, like, so we'll chalk up DMT and we'll say, okay, we're going to park that, we're going to keep this conversation, and then what we're going to do is we're going to come back in and we're going to do it with DMT. And mixed in with this kind of conversational model, we'll be using video, like video clips, stuff like from Vice that's really useful, stuff around the war on drugs. We'll be giving them historical context as to, why is cannabis illegal? Why has this even happened? What about cannabis versus alcohol? So we'll be filling in the blanks. They're using lots of kind of, lots of pen and whiteboard, like my team are amazing kind of artistic, creative people who can hold a whole room of kids who we are often told won't listen, won't come in, won't engage. And I can count on one hand the amount of times young people have left sessions, and it's generally due to a fear which is related to attachment around kind of not feeling okay in that room, and they come back. But it's really this kind of multi-component offer, and multi-component in its literal sense as well, I guess, of always offering a one-to-one space outside that group setting. So we are going in and working with that group, but we are also identifying and signposting for young people and offering a safe space to speak about things that they don't want to talk about in the group, at the end of the group, and having the flex within the service to be able to respond to that. So taking a call from a school or a college, in the middle of the week when your session's not till Monday, they've just come and asked if you can talk to them, and having that space to be able to get to them. And that's about kind of being bespoke in our roles and not being treatment workers. So being set aside as group workers who just do that role essentially with groups. So not having a caseload and having the time to reflect, and having regular supervision and that kind of thing so that we can cope with that stuff.
That's fantastic. I mean, it sounds like you've got the time and space to be able to really develop those relationships rather than being sort of rushed through from one individual to the next, which is often the case with adult services as well. Yeah. The other thing that I was thinking about was you were talking, I was like, why isn't there like early intervention for parents and carers as well? It's just like there should be more of this kind of work done with like the other side of, because I don't know, often it's like there's such misunderstanding, and if only you could create a more educated crowd and then create kind of safe spaces for people to talk about things where they live at home. But yeah
100%. And we do, in Kent for We Are With You, we do have a parent partnership offer where we're offer parents 3 sessions of kind of MI and CBT techniques and understanding young people's substance misuse or substance use. But I think, you know, the issue is that time, you know, which we are afforded, and it's that time for parents that often there's so many kind of factors coming together, aren't they? And the reason perhaps we're working with the young people is I think it's fair to say that it's always in some way linked into kind of family life and what's going on at home, and just the pressures that these parents who are sometimes kids raising kids initially and then moving into young parenthood, living in very adverse conditions some of the time, not always. And it can work at the other end of the spectrum of parents who might work in the city for 6 days a week, very, very long hours. And they're, you know, that kind of Johann Hari feeling of, you know, dependent use or addiction being the opposite of connection is, it just comes through so strongly. And I find that when we do parent inputs for schools, or we come and kind of do service presentations, or we talk about what we do, we talk about young person's substance use, you know, we've normally got the wrong parents in the room. We've got the parents who are there because they care so much, and they're so engaged and so involved and so worried that something might happen. It's like, well, if you keep facilitating these open, positive conversations with your children, it's going to be fine. Like, you know, they probably will experiment with substances like you probably did, you know, like we probably did. And it's going to be okay, albeit anxiety provoking. And I think whichever side you sit on the education fence, whether it's this prohibition, just say no kind of side, or whether it's let's sit down and talk respectfully, I think the thing that we have to remember, and the thing that I kind of carry with me, is that it's always well intentioned. Like, just say no was to an extent, and is certainly from a teacher parent kind of point of view, is well intentioned, that no one wants young people to be experimenting with drugs, really. You know, we can get into a human rights kind of discussion about it as well, and where that sits in terms of like their competency to consent and things like that. But it would definitely be better if they waited until they were fully developed, if they waited until they'd finished at school, which is stressful enough. But part of that is the reason why they use them, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah, of course. I guess I didn't, you know, maybe I don't fully understand this because I'm not a parent or a teacher of younger children. I teach people who are like legally considered to be adults. But like, of course, I know it's well intentioned, even though it falls short in practice. But to me, it's just about sort of, you know, a harm reduction approach being more realistic in terms of, and also ultimately producing better outcomes. So I don't know about what you think about harm reduction in that respect, but I think
I completely agree. I think it's slightly different if I am asked to work with 10, 11, 12-year-olds, which happens rarely, I think. But then I do think that harm reduction is still there. For me, there is still a opportunity to minimize the risk around legal, in kind of quote marks, substances. So when working with those young people, I will generally lean towards energy drinks, caffeine, cigarettes, vapes, and alcohol. You know, and start talking to young people about the reality of alcohol, which is very, very much minimized across the whole education system. That I'm yet to meet an adult really who knows the full extent of the harms of alcohol. I'm always keen to slide Professor Nutt's book, Drink, across to them, although many people, I think it sits on their shelf and they give it back 6 weeks later.
And I mean, it's not just, it's like, it's in terms of the, you know, the science is there, but it's not getting through to the general public.
No.
But the experiences should, because I distinctly remember myself and my friends like puking our guts out, literally being poisoned, and that didn't happen with other substances in the same way that it did with alcohol. So it's just like even the actual experiential effects are so much more intense, visibly so, for, I think, for people. So
yeah, that is a very strange disconnect, isn't it, between the kind of uneasy, perhaps anxiety that you might get from cannabis and the near-death experiences that I think nearly everyone experiences around alcohol, and the minimization of those even from a parent. And we've all got experience of this, right? And young people, it's Friday today, and hundreds of young people will be hospitalized tonight for alcohol related injury, and that information will not come to a treatment provider or to an early intervention team like the one that I work in. We won't. I mean, really, you'd want to be going in and working with that group who went out tonight. One of them or two of them fell very ill, and you just want to be making sure that they understood why and how that happened. And that obviously informs a lot of our education groups as well, is that quickly they will move into kind of more broader risk-taking behavior kind of conversations around, okay, so how can we prepare you for a night out? You're going to go out. What does that look like? What's your plan? And that's, young people just look at you blankly. And don't get me wrong, I never had a plan, but it would have helped if someone sat down and went, there's things you can do. You can charge your phone, you can tell someone where you're actually going as opposed to where you say you're going. Even if you just tell one person, basic drug education, having a meal before you go, like lots of hydration, this kind of stuff. And it's genuine news to young people. They're kind of, well, why would you do that? What does that look like? It's baffling, really. It really is. But I think your question around kind of harm reduction was, yeah, it's relevant because I think it is rooted in education. It's rooted in kind of having a really good knowledge of the potential of unregulated substances that you could come into contact with. And for me, it's really rooted in alcohol as being the primary substance of choice. And, the gateway theory has obviously been debunked 100 times for people such as us, but not for everyone. But really, it is alcohol, cigarettes and alcohol. Are these substances which young people do not get this initial education around, and therefore go out and make mistakes which can obviously lead to other substances. So I think that perhaps harm reduction for me is a Venn diagram somewhere between like risk and common sense. There's like in the middle somewhere, there's harm reduction, and that substance education definitely has a part to play with that. And that young people can absolutely understand that analogy at 14, 15, that we can talk to them about, the seatbelt analogy. We can talk to them about wearing a crash helmet if they go climbing, so we can talk to them about minimizing risk, about sex education as well, condoms, for example, about minimizing the risk, and that doesn't have to be detrimental to the experience. We can just avoid this kind of shotgun roulette, again, not a great analogy, but this kind of, we can minimize those risks for them. We don't put kids in cars with no driving lessons, we're kind of set on that we don't let them do that, however kind of confident they are about it. But there is a false confidence which comes into harm reduction as well. So and that doesn't have to be about a prevention of using a drug. It is about the prevention of harms that could go alongside that for me. So that's what we try and have underline and kind of conclude in every session is, okay, so we've learned quite a bit about that. We've tailored it to the group. We've kind of mashed in some stuff around risk-taking behavior, around drug identification. We've kind of dispelled some myths. And what are we left with? We're left with kind of the safest way possible that we think that you could potentially go out and have a really good night and look after each other and kind of, come out the other side smiling.
It's great because I think a lot of it is also about sort of turning the kind of negative talk into like, giving it a positive slant. It's just about emphasizing how much more enjoyable the experience can be if like you take certain precautions or whatever. So just like emphasizing the positive rather than just talking about the negative. And I think that's been sort of proven to be effective in harm reduction discussions, you know, in adult services as well, and even in relation to like injecting and so on. So it's just makes total sense. My next question is about I guess the drug policy environment and whether it in any way has affected your work. Because we were talking about it before. Adult services, I think, have tended to be affected quite greatly by austerity and a kind of focus on recovery. But I'm wondering whether, like, you know, early intervention and young people services have had you know, similar or different effects over the course of changes in sort of drug policy and strategies and so on.
I think I do think we're very lucky in Kent, and we've been very lucky with really robust commissioning teams who have ring-fenced and protected us. There's definitely been periods of time over the 10 years that I've been working, or 12 years that I've been working in the sector, where there's been periods of anxiety around, you know, where are the cuts, when are the cuts coming. I think that the cuts to other services, particularly around colleagues in the police and in youth centres, do have an impact on kind of a macro level, like the outside of kind of where young people are exposed to kind of street drinking, for example, kind of just not like those periods of austerity just do have a knock on into young people's behaviours without a doubt. But I think we have been quite protected, and the early intervention model is not one which we see across the country. So there are outreach teams, there are kind of bits and bobs of teams going into school, treatment workers going into school, but I don't know of another team who works quite in the way that we do, genuinely. And if there is, I'd love to kind of like discuss with them more, but it tends to be more whole school delivery or kind of moving in different kind of circles, like using drama or theatre and things like that. So I think we're very lucky, I guess, in terms of kind of changes in thinking around substances. There's like the policing of cannabis and the diversion schemes. We've run a diversion scheme in Kent for young people for over 10 years now, which kind of flew under the radar, which you know, is that, I guess that's about public perception.
Oh, yeah, all that noise about, you know, Sadiq Khan's, you know, pilot, and I was just like, well, you know, other authorities have been doing it for a long time. Like, what?
Yeah, and I think some of it is very much, you know, that people don't want to be seen to be kind of initiating some de facto decriminalisation, potentially in somewhere like Kent. But that stuff has been really positive, even though it's gone under the radar. But I think the way that CBD's been marketed, the kind of medicinal cannabis model, like the medical cannabis debates that have happened in America, and you know, where we've seen over half states switching models, and I guess that does kind of trickle down into our conversations, but luckily it doesn't affect us on the ground at this stage, and we feel quite secure to kind of be doing what we're doing, and maybe that we're coming back round to a more harm reduction focused kind of, to a more child-centered model when it comes to working with children, adolescents and young adults around substances, that there's more coverage and more positive media coverage than ever before coming from kind of lots of providers, really, but drugs are mainstream. And some of that comes with the difficulties of, you know, managing the psychedelic renaissance, for example, with young people and their perception of it. But there's way more positives from having a balanced conversation in the press. For me, I guess what we'd like to get to is more consistent messaging across the whole board, really, if we're getting to that blue sky thinking kind of question.
Oh, I love blue sky thinking, but yeah, it's like I think and I think you're right. There's also issues that require that, because there's been a boom in like the market for edibles, for example, which are obviously attractive to young people, and so it's and also the fact that I mean I'm sure that there is lots of good practice around the country, and different people and different teams are doing lots of good work, but it's like it would be good to also have discussions and kind of like a more maybe a unified approach, like finding some standards that can that I guess the government can really get behind, and then organizing some kind of campaign nationally, because otherwise all the good practice is still there, but it's sort of in some ways lost, or doesn't get as much air and as much like as much kind of attention as it should.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100% agree that there's the consistency is not lost on drug treatment services, for example, and feeding into NDTMS is not a kind of kite mark for consistency, and some of the messaging will vary greatly to young people across the country, and some of the skill set of the workforce as well, of course, supervisory models as well, getting the right support, the culture of drug treatment services and what that looks like in a city as opposed to kind of rurally, and just bodies on the ground as well. It's it's a really complicated issue, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're not going to resolve it right now, but in terms of blue sky thinking and kind of utopia stuff, because I always like to end with a utopia question. What is your vision? What is your vision of the future for I guess in relation to, maybe not just in relation to policy, but just anything that you see as a positive change that you'd like to see in the future?
I think long term, I would sit in the legalise and regulate camp, just because we can look at it from many different ways. I guess for alcohol, young people still have access to alcohol, of course, and they're still making mistakes around it. But of course, with regulated substances, we take away that kind of mystery white powder, just kind of rogue substance purity kind of issues to an extent. There's still an issue for me around the black market that would sit below that, particularly for young people, and how we would kind of protect them amongst that, where potentially purity could go down or become even more scattergun for them. But I guess, like, broadly speaking, we know that drug related deaths are avoidable, and for me that would solve a large part of that problem, whilst not being a panacea. I think in line with that, drug checking in city centres and drug consumption rooms, and all the positive things that that we see in our sector, which kind of do to an extent remain in our sector and don't get that coverage that we'd like to see. But I'd love to see more of that. And kind of thinking about a utopia, it would, for me, I kind of think of like my volunteering work at festivals with welfare providers like Chill Welfare, and working alongside guys like The Loop, and the strategic kind of meetings that go on festival sites, where you're absolutely pulling the world of that festival together, and having mental health services, police, security, drug workers, welfare workers, and every other significant other in a really tight, cohesive, communicative meeting, and then going back into the day to kind of better it, to work more effectively. I've seen that work so well, and I think it's a big ask, like in terms of a national picture, but that's like that cohesion, that consistency, particularly a consistency in policing, everyone knowing their remit and knowing how they're going to be policing substances, would work really well. And I also think, obviously, from my point of view, a huge investment in education and in kind of radical public service advertising. But I guess in education, for my mind, a blue sky thinking kind of utopia would be that you could have someone in a role that my team operate in as an early intervention, as an expert, an independent expert in a school. you could have one in every school, or certainly in every cluster of schools, working in a multidisciplinary team alongside a school social worker who was working in a child-centered way, again, who had the ability to kind of meet the needs of that 1,000 students in that school. So often there's one counsellor trying to see hundreds of children in what is without a doubt a mental health crisis. And I think what it needs is experts to be alongside these young people. They spend so much time in school. It's such a protective factor, even as it is. So if we could really tool schools up to have the resources to pull on expertise to meet these young people's needs in a place where they feel safe, where they can be fed and where they can be nurtured, I think for me, we would see a lot of changes in terms of adverse childhood experiences, in terms of early intervention with trauma and positive relationships, and more of that connection with professionals, which I think we're potentially lacking in the UK today.
God, I support this manifesto completely. Just sign me up. Let's do it tomorrow. Let's do it tomorrow. Yeah, thank you so much. I agree that I feel like the culture of communication that we currently have, I think also, and the lack of funding and investment, really prevents us from being able to achieve that kind of collaborative, multidisciplinary, the kind of microcosm of the festival that you described on a much bigger level, like on a national scale, as well as in the school environment as well. And I just love that as an analogy. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Oh, cool. No worries at all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick, for taking the time. And I'll see you all. Well, I'll see you, Nick, hopefully soon. And I'll be back with another episode soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.